All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to have everyone with me today. I want to thank all of you for joining me for the webinar today. Let's not take too much time in the preamble. Let's make sure that we dive in and start going through the content. So this webinar is all about really a SharePoint Framework introduction. We're not going to go really deep into the SharePoint Framework. I just want to make sure we have a very high-level understanding of what the SharePoint Framework is. I have a few demos. We'll see how to set up your developer environment very fast. And then we'll also see how to build a web part and kind of walk through your first project. This is actually the first in a series of webinars that I plan to start doing on a more regular basis. I plan to start doing these at least once a month. So I'm curious to hear like what you think about it. If you want to learn more about what other webinars I've already scheduled, you can check my website for more information on that. If you just go to voitanos.io/webinars. I've got future webinars already scheduled and published that you can register for on SharePoint Framework development, Microsoft Teams app development, Copilot extensibility, and more. But I'd love to hear what you have to say and what you want to see. I have ideas what I want to do, but it's really about what everybody else wants to see. But who am I? I guess that's one thing I should probably at least introduce here on, like, say who is the person that you're joining. My name is Andrew Connell. I've been doing SharePoint development much longer than I would recommend. I've been doing it for over 20 years. I go back to September 2003. I've worked with every major version of SharePoint Server. I've worked with all of the development options that we've had, even before we even had developer options, and we were all like manual stuff. I've been around the SharePoint world forever. I was one of the very first people involved with the SharePoint framework as well, and the fact that I actually saw the specifications for it that Microsoft was planning on doing even prior to them even writing a line of code back in like 2015 or 2016. But at any rate, I'm a 20-year Microsoft MVP. I have a mostly focus in Microsoft 365 development. So that's going to be in the areas of SharePoint Framework development, Microsoft Teams app development, so bots, message extensions, dialogues, tabs, personal apps, SharePoint Embedded, something else I do a lot of, and lately spending a lot more time on Microsoft 365 Copilot, working with both declarative agents and custom engine agents. So doing actually a webinar on that coming up soon too. You can see how to contact me in the bottom left. You can find all of my socials if you just go to my name, andrewconnell.social, and it's like the NASCAR page of all the social platforms that I'm on. The ones you see there at the bottom, though, those are the ones that I'm most active on and I spend the most time on. And actually, one of those is probably going to fall off soon, being Threads. I'm kind of the person that's like, I only really need one long form option, which is LinkedIn. I only need one short form option, which for me is Blue Sky. I've really been enjoying that one, and the lack of an algorithm and just getting the stuff that I follow. I have a company called Voitanos where I do a lot of like SharePoint and Microsoft 365 developer education, a lot of free resources, a lot of free videos, video courses, email courses, but then I also sell a bunch of courses as well. And as I said, I'm an MVP as well here. So what are we going to cover today? So I really have like two big categories of things that I want to cover here. So why do we need the SharePoint framework and what is it? So we're going to do a very fast history lesson. I believe that when you're learning about something, especially in our tech space, I believe that when you're learning about something, one of the biggest things that is going to help you is if you understand the reason and the motivations why this was created. It's going to answer a lot of questions for us. So if those of you who are new to the SharePoint framework or you have no experience with it, but you're a server-side SharePoint developer like Farm Solutions, one of the questions I usually get from you is, how do I do impersonation, like run with elevated privileges? I like to call it run with scissors. Or how do I do like timer jobs? And the answer is you'll see is that that's not what SharePoint framework was intended to address. And so you can't get mad at something. You can't get mad at a car because it doesn't make toast. It's like it wasn't intended for that. So if you understand what the intention was, then you understand what the scope is. All right. Then I'm going to dive more into the SharePoint framework, and I'm going to teach you a little bit more about, understand what the developer toolchain looks like. It's very different from what we've done in the past. And then how do we go about building client-side web parts? But first, a lot of you, when you registered, there was a question on the forum that you didn't have to answer, but a lot of you did. And I asked you, what would be the what do you want to walk away from this webinar and feel like this was worth your time? What do you want to see answered? And I kind of grouped it into 4 different buckets here. So a lot of you on the basics in getting started section are, you wanted the benefits and capabilities of SharePoint Framework. What are the basic building blocks that are available to us? You say a self-teaching is set up too is one category there. And what I mean by that is, like, where can I learn without having to get a course, or like, where can self-teaching is more like, I don't want to have to go sit in a classroom, or maybe you can extend that to say, I don't want to go pay for a course that I have to watch as a video or on-demand course. How do you get started with a basic SharePoint Framework solution? What is the toolchain overview? We're going to cover all of those things. Then a lot of you asked about specific use cases. So customizing search with new web parts, using web parts for site provisioning, data integration for dashboards and statistics, document management systems with SharePoint Online, and implementing SaaS solutions with document review and overview. I'm going to be honest, we're not going to cover any of that. And the reason why is because those are also very specific use case scenarios. And this is meant to be more like, let's focus on what we can do with the SharePoint framework, not let's go deep dive into all of those. Each one of those things we could spend an entire hour on. In fact, one of those things on the using web parts for site provisioning that a few of you asked about, I would recommend you not do that. But we can get into that at the end with some questions. You also had a couple other banks of questions here about like technical implementation, project structure, and file organization. I'll talk a little bit about that. One of you even sent me an email about this and saying, like, you see all these folders and stuff in a project, what do they all mean? Examples of SharePoint Framework with app registration and Azure services, real-world examples and sample code projects, creating single-page apps, and then alternative tooling options beyond React and TypeScript. Look, some of those things we're going to cover, some of them we're not going to cover. For example, this one right here about alternative tooling options beyond React and TypeScript. Well, you're not going to have another option other than TypeScript. Technically, you could do JavaScript, but it's going to be really hard to do JavaScript because everything expects you to be using TypeScript. Beyond using React, you can use any web framework you want. So I'm not going to go into like how you do that, but really you can use any web framework you want. It's just that React is already on the page. If you're going to use another framework, you've got to go through and add that yourself. This piece here about examples with Azure and app registrations, we're not doing that. That goes in a little bit more depth than I was going to try and cover in this webinar. Great question. It's just going to be a little bit more than what we want to dive into. And then down here on the advanced topics, okay, this is all stuff that we're not going to be able to get into, right? This is all of these things. I mean, some of you wanted to like dive in, and a lot of you said this too blatantly. You said, hey, I know this is an overview webinar, but you're like old school guy in SharePoint Framework. You've got a lot of experience. This is the stuff that I really want. That's cool. That's not what this is. I do have another webinar coming up called Tips and Tricks and Hidden Gems with the SharePoint Framework. That's a whole bunch of like, think of it like ninja-based stuff that I show. But we can always do another webinar in the coming months on specific implementations and stuff. Like we could talk about Fluent UI. I've got one on Copilot agents that I am going to be doing custom agents. I'll be doing in a month or two. You can already register for that. Teams Toolkit integration with SharePoint Framework. It's there, but I wouldn't use it. We can talk about why later. Okay, let's go ahead and let's dive in. As I'm going through this, please take advantage of the fact of dropping questions in, and I'm happy to jump those questions in as they come up. Or if we don't have time, I'll go through them all at the very end. So I'll definitely get your questions answered. I just can't promise that we're going to get them done during the presentation. I may just do it towards the end here. Okay. So let's move on. Why are my slides not advancing? There we go. Okay. So I want to do a very brief introduction. Now, or history lesson here. And the reason why I want to do a history lesson is because you're going to see where the evolution of SharePoint Framework came from and why Microsoft created it for this use. So SharePoint Portal Server 2003, this was the very first one. This was when I got into it. It was based on .NET Framework 2.0, but everything was server-side. There was nothing available to us in terms of an API that we could play with. There was no help with doing deployment of our solutions. we had to figure everything out on our own. There's no documentation. Everything we had to figure out on our own. So it was a lot of, if those of you are as old as I am, you may remember a .NET tool called the .NET Reflector. And so it was a lot of getting these SharePoint binaries and decompiling them and looking at how they worked and how we could then go through and tie in our own stuff and build web parts and build things that went in different areas. Area was actually a thing back then. Microsoft saw a lot of people with this version start to do a lot of this stuff, and they wanted to go through and they saw custom solutions as an opportunity. And so they said, well, we need to do something to give people the ability to do this. And so what they did is in the next release of SharePoint, the big version was Office SharePoint Server 2007, which is based on the core free version of Windows SharePoint Services 3.0. This came out again about 2007. This was still 100% server-side, all server-side APIs. But what they did was they introduced two big things that made our lives a lot easier. They introduced this thing called a feature, which is with a capital F, which really is just a folder with a bunch of XML and other stuff inside of it. And what that did is that, think of that as like the plugin infrastructure for SharePoint for us to define some sort of reusable functionality, like a web part. And we want to be able to install that plugin into different sites throughout our SharePoint environment, or package it up using a solution, another new thing. And when we deployed it to our SharePoint environment, SharePoint would put those files on all the servers in the farm for us. So we wouldn't have to do all of those different deployments ourselves. It made life a lot easier doing it this way. Now, a lot of customers saw this and they went crazy with it, right? I was one of those customers as well. We saw a huge adoption of SharePoint in this time of people building custom solutions, because now we could actually build real applications on top of SharePoint, now that we had this plugin infrastructure and now that we had a way to do our deployment. The challenge, though, that we had in this time was we saw a bunch of SharePoint was very expensive. It was expensive in licensing, it was expensive in hardware, and also human capital to be able to run these different environments. And so it was really only available to like the mid-cap and the large-cap companies. The small businesses really couldn't get into this because it was so expensive. So we saw some hosting companies start to come up with different solutions here. And one of the and that was more of like a subscription model. But one of the challenges with that is that SharePoint wasn't really made to be multi-tenant at that time. And what I mean by that is, if I was using SharePoint, let's just say keep it simple. I was on one server, or I was on one collection of servers, a SharePoint farm. It wasn't intended to have both my company and somebody else's company running on that same infrastructure. Partly the data wasn't segmented, but second of all, is if I did some custom development and I screwed something up and it blew up at runtime, it would bring down the entire farm, which would affect not just me, but all the other customers that were in the same infrastructure. So there was this whole virtualization they tried to figure out, and they had to go through and separate different servers. It was a bit of a pain. Now, Microsoft saw this hosting environment start to grow, and they saw an opportunity and a demand for people to get into SharePoint and to get a SharePoint development, and for small business to get into it, but they weren't doing it. They were still shipping a product, and other companies were doing the hosting for them. So the next thing they did was in 2010, they wanted to address some of this stuff. And the way they did it was, the big thing that they did is they said, we're going to introduce a multi-tenant solution. We need to have a way for you to be able to have multiple companies on the same infrastructure and have a multi-tenant solution. But we also need to make sure that there's no noisy neighbor problem. In other words, if I write a web part and it all of a sudden does a division by 0, and so it throws a runtime exception, I don't bring down the SharePoint process for other customers, or I don't bring it down for my entire company as well. I don't bring down the intranet. Instead, I really should only break my web part, and that part of the page where my web part is the only thing that should be affected by this. So what they did is they introduced this thing called a sandbox solution. So now we had this thing, we used to create things called solutions, and now we had a new name for them now, because now they're called farm solutions, also known as fully trusted. We didn't know that's what they were at the time, or they didn't have a name for it because it was the only thing that was there. Now we have a new type of them, so we gave a name to the old one called farm solutions, and to the new one, sandbox solutions. And what a sandbox solution is basically it's a partially trusted solution. So our code, if we have a box, our code wouldn't, in a farm trusted solution, would run in the SharePoint process, in the same process where SharePoint was running. So if it blew up SharePoint as well, and you'd have to restart the web server. In a sandbox solution, SharePoint would be running the entire intranet in the SharePoint process, and then our code would run inside of a user code process or the sandbox process. And so if we blew up our stuff, SharePoint's talking to this other process, and if we blew up our web part, it wouldn't affect SharePoint. The worst thing that would happen is a little error would show up on the page saying that something happened with this web part, or it would just be blank. Now that's good because now SharePoint can be a multi-tenant solution, and it can also be, customers can also build solutions that were much safer. But the problem with this was that a lot of companies didn't, or a lot of customers didn't like it, because in order to do that, we had to lose a lot of functionality that we had with the API, because we now were only allowed to work inside of a sandbox, and we were also limited just to the current site collection that our code was running in. We couldn't cross site collections, which was a big thing in a lot of organizations. Now, another thing that Microsoft did in this version was they introduced a client-side API. And this is, again, think way, way back. This is about 15 years ago. We still didn't have, like, client-side solutions were really a big thing back then, right? And when we didn't, they weren't like a first-class citizen. We didn't have like people building like single-page apps yet. And so we didn't have like a lot of REST APIs that were seen as like something that was a common thing across most platforms. What Microsoft did is they created this thing called the client-side object model. And what this was, there were 3 flavors of it. There was a JavaScript version, a .NET version, and a Silverlight version. Silverlight version died pretty quick. And the other 2 are still around, although we tell everybody don't use the JavaScript one. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to use SharePoint Framework's APIs. This was what this would be is this would allow us to write an application that didn't live on the physical SharePoint server. It either ran in the browser, where SharePoint was running as well, or it would be running, like, say, on our laptop that would be able to connect in to SharePoint remotely. That was the first introduction of a client-side solution. Okay, so we've addressed the multi-tenant problem. We've addressed the multi-tenant problem. We've addressed the other problem that we had related to what's it called? The noisy neighbor issue as well. And we've addressed in the multi-tenant problem, but we still haven't addressed like some of the other issues that we're having here about like customizations, because now the development story is more limited than what originally was, and that so many people were loving back in 2007. Microsoft actually had a problem here because a lot of companies didn't upgrade to 2010 because of these limitations. They stayed on 2007. And so Microsoft's like, well, we only make money on licensing. And if people aren't upgrading, they're not buying new licenses. And so we need to make it easier for them to be able to upgrade than having to go through and have to retest all of their custom code. So they did some more stuff in the next release in 2013. And that release had a heavy investment on client-side APIs. The big thing that they wanted to focus on here was they had a motivation to say, look, all of you developers building custom solutions, we want you off of the SharePoint server. We want all of your customizations you're going to do not running on the SharePoint hardware. We want it instead to either running in the client, so in the browser when SharePoint renders, or go run it on your own infrastructure, and simply we'll have our stuff call into yours and pull back the data and render it from there. So what they did is they did 2 big things here. They introduced, or they went really big on investing in client-side APIs, specifically REST APIs, and they really built this out. We went from ASMX-style SOAP web services to REST-based APIs. And then they also introduced our 3rd development model, which is SharePoint's add-in model. It was originally called the app model, but maybe if someone asks a question, I'll tell you later, Apple actually made them change it. They won't admit that, but I've got the backstory on that one. And so they introduced this thing called the SharePoint add-in model. Now, why did they do that? The idea, or what is that? The idea behind the add-in model is that you had 2 types of add-ins. Either your add-ins were going to run in the client, in the browser, or they were going to run on the server in your own infrastructure. So SharePoint hosted add-ins, we deployed to SharePoint, and they contained all of the client-side code, JavaScript, HTML, images, CSS, and they would simply get served up by SharePoint, but they would run in the browser. So if that stuff broke, it wouldn't affect SharePoint at all. It would just affect that user's browser. Provider-hosted add-ins are, I am the developer, otherwise known as the provider of the solution. So I'm responsible for hosting it. I simply make SharePoint aware of it. And then when they add my solution to the page, SharePoint's going to call out to my infrastructure, and I'm going to return back the stuff that it needs to be able to build out the page. But it's not going to, it's like client-side based web parts and stuff. Everything is still running in the browser, but if I need server-side code, it's running on my servers, not on Microsoft's, on SharePoint's servers. Again, though, we still had some challenges with this, and a lot of people hated these things because add-ins were also very limiting. They never ran inside the same site where they were deployed. They always ran inside of a subsite of our site. So a lot of customers looked at it and said, we want to be able to customize SharePoint. We don't want to have to create a subsite and have our customizations run there. We want our customizations to be treated like first-class citizens. So the community, starting in around after 2013 or in 2013 and going into SharePoint Server 2016, they started doing these things, this technique called JavaScript injection. And what they did with this is they built client-side solutions using JavaScript. Usually it meant a lot of jQuery, meant a lot of CSS, meant a lot of images. And they added that to the page through either a content editor web part or a script editor web part, two out-of-the-box web parts that we had. And so when I built something for a customer, I'd effectively give the customer some instructions to say, go to your site, put the site in edit mode, add a content editor web part to the site, and then put it in edit mode, go into the content editor web part and copy in all of this code, or upload some files to a document library and then copy in all of this code. The challenge of that approach, it was brittle. Anybody with editor rights on the page could go in and try and start making some changes to the JavaScript. The customizations were not easily repeatable. No one wants to just have like this Word document they send to the admins and say, hey, on Friday night, would you do this deployment of all of these steps for me? Because I can't do it in production. And in addition, this stuff wasn't always allowed because we had things like sites with these tags called no script, which would block these kinds of customizations. Microsoft at around this time looked at this. And at this time now, we've got Office 365, a hosted solution that Microsoft now offers. So we got small businesses that are using SharePoint now. We've got large businesses. But most importantly, Microsoft is now in the business of hosting SharePoint, not just for them, but for other companies. And what does that mean? That means they can see how we're using it. So in 2016, they went and they looked at all customer deployments across Office 365, and they're like, guess what the most used web part is across the entire Office 365 platform? The content editor web part and the script editor web part. And why is that? Because it was the only way we could do our development stuff. And that was a signal that they said that to Microsoft by standing in the mirror and saying, nobody likes our development stuff. Nobody likes our development options. So they're having to come up with their own. Okay, here's an approach. We need to treat that as a first-class citizen, and we need to go where developers are going and where customers want. That's why we have the SharePoint framework. That's the motivation behind it. It was to take the client-side development and customizations that people were doing on their own with the SharePoint, with content editor web parts, and they wanted to make it a first-class story. They wanted to have a way where I could build the solution, I could package it up, I could deploy it to SharePoint as a reusable component, I install it on the site, and then a user would put the page in edit mode, and there's my web part in the toolbox that I can add to the page. That's it. They wanted to make it that easy. That's the main thing that SharePoint Framework was there to do. So they also did some other stuff too, but that's the big piece. That's why it's number one on my slide. They also went through and did some stuff to make it easy to get access to SharePoint data. They wanted to make it easy to call these different SharePoint REST services to get data from SharePoint lists and libraries. They wanted to also make sure that we didn't have to deal with all the security stuff because everything is running in the client, because everything's running in the browser. Everything is always running under the context of the currently signed in user. So there is no such thing as impersonation. If you're an old school SharePoint developer that's familiar with that spsecurity.run with elevated privileges, there's no way to do that. There's no way to do that in the SharePoint framework because in order to do that, you would need another user's credentials, meaning their password or their secret. And if it's being put in a client-side solution, I guarantee it's not a secret anymore because all you got to do is view the source of the page and you can see what their passwords are. So you can't do that. There are options for impersonating another user or getting elevated access, but not in the SharePoint framework. We can leverage the SharePoint framework, or the SharePoint framework can leverage a custom thing that does that. The SharePoint framework doesn't do that. And that's something, if you're interested in, just put a question in the chat and we'll address that at the end. Now, the other thing is that the development, they say that the customizations are going to be responsive and accessible. So these bullet points are, a lot of them are from Microsoft. So I'm going to give you a little bit of my commentary that goes with them. They like to say all their customizations now as SharePoint Framework are responsive and accessible for mobile. Okay, number one, that means they're not using iframes anymore. They're using divs. Number two, no one's using SharePoint on a mobile device. The payload of the page is ridiculously big. There's a reason why they created a SharePoint app for iOS and Android. It's because the web experience for mobile sucks. So they didn't have a choice. They had to do it this way. So this is a kind of okay, yeah, you can say, hey, it's great, it's secure. It's like, well, yeah, it's secure because it doesn't work. The next thing is the development experience. It says they embraced the web development stack. What does that mean? Well, they got rid of the .NET story, and they're all client-side, and they're using the same tools and open source tools that the majority of the web developer community is using these days. And I'll go through those in a bit. Also, they say customizations work in classic mode, in publishing pages, and in modern pages. Kinda. Not everything works in classic, only web parts do. Most of the stuff, I guess, works in publishing pages, although most people aren't using that anymore. SharePoint Framework is intended for modern pages. Web parts work in classic, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't work in classic that we do with the SharePoint Framework, and it's mostly around these things called extensions. The last one that's there is actually a really big deal, and they say that the SharePoint Framework is both for first party and third party. What does that mean? First party means that Microsoft says, we built this platform for us to use. Third party means we built this development platform for customers to use. In the past, Microsoft never used any of the sandbox solutions or add-in styles of development. They never did that for their own stuff. They always used farm solutions because they could get done when they needed to get done. In other words, they didn't feel the pain that we were going through with add-ins or with sandbox solutions. They didn't feel that pain, so they didn't appreciate it. They didn't have empathy for us. But now with the SharePoint Framework, they do. And a lot of the things we see show up in the SharePoint Framework, if you follow the release notes as closely as I do, you'll see stuff and you're like, nobody's going to use that. I get how you guys need that for the product, but no, we're not going to use it. So a lot of times I've seen these releases for the SharePoint Framework that have stuff for them that we can use, but none of us are going to end up using it. Like they'll add stuff because they need it for Viva connections or something like that. Okay, this always comes up. I'm going to throw it at you right now. If you are on SharePoint on premises, so you're not going to have a great SharePoint Framework experience. You're going to have a kind of a subpar. And the reason why is because Microsoft does not upgrade the SharePoint Framework on the server deployments. So SharePoint Server 2016 got the SharePoint Framework with Feature Pack 2. The highest version of the SharePoint Framework you can use is 1.1. For SharePoint Server 2019 and SharePoint Server Subscription Edition, they shipped with SharePoint Framework version 1.4.1. Now, SharePoint Server Subscription Edition, his SharePoint Framework upgrade story is an absolute disaster. They took it from 1.4.1, they went up to 1.5.1, and then they dropped it back down to 1.5.0. And they did stuff that, frankly, was way outside the bounds of the support that the SharePoint Framework team allowed. In fact, I'll give you a dirty little secret, not much of a secret I'm doing on a webinar. When the SharePoint Server Subscription Edition team shipped a feature pack about 2 years ago, and they touted, hey, we did an upgrade to the SharePoint Framework that you can now go from 1.4.1 to 1.5.1. And when I saw the instructions for it, because Microsoft has me go through and review all of the documentation and content updates to the developer docs for SharePoint, when I saw the instructions, I raised my hand and I went to Microsoft, the SharePoint Framework team, and I'm like, are you guys cool with this? Because everything that I've known here, like for the last 5 years, everything you said says that what this guidance is doing is completely contradictory to what you guys have said. You're basically mixing versions on the same app. And they're like, What are you talking about? They had no idea that the server-side team was actually doing this. I'm the one that brought this to their attention. And then it was even funnier because the more we went into it, they were like, "Who are you talking to?" And I'm like, "I'm talking to this guy." I'm not gonna say his name, but I'm like, "I'm talking to this guy, and he's telling me how all this stuff works." And they're like, "Wait, who is that guy?" I'm like, "Wait, you don't even know who this guy is?" Like, "Yeah, how did you find him?" And I'm like, "He works for Microsoft. He's on the sustained engineering team." And they're like, what's his last name?" And they're trying to find him in the galleries. I'm like, should I introduce you guys so you guys can talk?" And I did, and then everybody stopped talking to me, and apparently, like, stuff blew up then. So I have a whole article that explains this if you're interested on my site. What these links are here is that if you are on any of these SharePoint server um, on-premises versions, setting up your developer environment is very hard. I'm going to go through what it's like for if you're like starting out for SharePoint Online today. It's much easier. These are hard. It goes from harder to less hard because you've got to do some like little fiddling with the 2016 one. But these guides walk you through all the steps and they explain the why and what you have to do to make certain changes. But they work. They work. I've gotten all this stuff to work. So those are there available on my site if you like. Okay. So that's the SharePoint framework. Now, the next thing I want to go through is what can we build? What kinds of things can we build with the SharePoint framework? So we can build three main kinds of things here. There's another one, but we're not going to really go into it. We're going to build web parts and think of those as like little boxes on a page. We've probably all seen them. These are the things that I can drag from the toolbox and add to the page. I can build custom things like that. In fact, those web parts, so I call it a component, but it's really just, it's a web part. It's a box that's going to go on the page. These can have public properties. They're going to load some JavaScript, and effectively, you'll see in the code in a bit that when a web part runs, we effectively, SharePoint is just going to call one method and give us a reference to the div on the page where our web part is going to be placed. And so we run, when we run that method, the render method, we are simply going to write the results back to an inner HTML property on the DOM element that they pass to us. We're not supposed to go and modify anything else on the page. That would be considered DOM manipulation, and that would be against the contract that Microsoft has with us to make sure that we won't break stuff. We can also use web parts as the foundation for creating single-page applications. All that really is just instead of a canvas on the page where we can add lots of web parts, we simply can only add one web part to the page. Creates a brand new page, adds that one web part to it, and now it takes up the full page, except for the header and this, including the sweep bar and the navigation going down the left-hand side. We can take up the majority of the page. So one of you or a handful of you asked about building single-page apps. I'll show you. It's just literally it's one little string you put inside of an array, and all of a sudden it'll show up as an option. Furthermore, you could also use the SharePoint framework for creating tabs that are going to work inside of Microsoft Teams and personal apps. We're not going to get into it today, but I'll show you where that is. It's the same place where the single page apps are. I think this is a terrible option. It does not work well. It is not reliable. So footnote, that's just my opinion. Microsoft says, hey, this is a great option. Other people disagree with me. I've got really good reasons for why this is a bad option, but it is. So take that for what it's worth. Okay, extensions. These are little things we can do to embellish the user experience. So for example, I can add buttons to the toolbar or of a list or a library, or to the context menu on a list or a library. I can change the rendering of a cell in every cell in a column in a list using JavaScript. I can also create custom forms for my SharePoint lists and document libraries, the view form, the edit form, and the new form. Basically, I'm just building a big web part. I'm building a single page app, and I'm telling SharePoint Framework, whenever somebody clicks the new form, load this instead of your form. And we take over a lot of responsibility with that, in both loading the data and saving the data. But it allows us to kind of overrule how SharePoint does forms, and it keeps us from having to use Power Apps, which are more single point editing solutions. Whereas our solution now can be deployed to multiple sites and have those same forms used everywhere. The other type that we have is a thing called an app customizer. It's the most robust one, I think, because it allows us to run JavaScript on the page, and it gives us access to two divs at the top and the bottom of the page. Big thing with this, though, like for a scenario, is that let's say you wanted to add like Google Analytics or Microsoft Clarity to your SharePoint tenant. we all know, if we've used it, SharePoint as an administrator before, the telemetry and the usage analysis of how our customers, our employees are using our SharePoint tenant, it sucks. Microsoft has done a terrible job on the telemetry side. So you could use a tool like Microsoft Clarity, which is free, or Google Analytics, also free, but you could choose which one you like, which one you prefer. An app customizer is a great way to get that on the page. In fact, that's something I teach very frequently in my classes. The last one is an adaptive card extension. These are like little tiles that if you click on the tile, it opens up a bigger tile, and then you can do some quick little action with it, and then that little tile goes away. These are going to show up on dashboards. They're also used as a way to customize Viva Connections, which is essentially just SharePoint in an app within Teams, right? I'm going to show you how to do web parts today. The other two options are a little bit deeper than we want to dive into. So let me show you what it looks like to go build a SharePoint Framework solution here. So I'm going to switch over to my demo machine here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start. I'm already have my machine all set up, and I'm going to show you how to set yours up in just a little bit. So let's jump into, let's create our first project here. And so I'm going to start by saying, I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll call this my first web part. And I'm going to cd into that folder, my first web part. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and create the project. So I'm going to do that by saying yo at Microsoft/SharePoint and hit enter. Now what this is doing is it's running what's called a Yeoman generator, which is going to ask me some questions and then create the folders and the files necessary for my project. The same kind of thing we'd do like if we were in Visual Studio and we said file new project, go through our wizard. And when the wizard's done, it creates folders and files and then loads that inside of Visual Studio. So here it's going to ask me a few questions. What do you want to call it? First one is fine. What kind of a thing do you want to create? A web part. What is its name? Well, legally, we have to say contractually obligated to always choose our very first project as Hello World. So I'll do that. What template do you want to use? Oh, so many questions. I'll just say minimal. Oh, that's not what I actually wanted. Whatever, we'll leave it. All right, so we'll go ahead, and what it's doing now is it's downloading all the dependencies. So I'm going to launch Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go find that project while those dependencies are being loaded. And here we have our project. So what do we have here? Inside of the source folder, this is where all of our code is going to be. And then everything inside of the config folder is where we have ways to do different configurations. Now, we're not going to dive through all these different files here. Most of them you can ignore. Some of them are important, but you should not delete them. Some of them you can absolutely delete. They don't mean anything. Like Microsoft just does not, I still don't understand why we have this npm ignore file here. There is absolutely zero reason for this file in this project. And the README file is also just a bunch of like marketing garbage. So we don't even need that. But I mean, I'm not going to get rid of it because it's just more stuff to clean up. And I mean, let's face it, we're not going to clean up this stuff on every project. Okay, so what we're doing now, the next thing you see that just popped up was this node modules. And this is a list of all the dependencies that we need to be able to build and package up this project. So if I look inside, that's what the stuff was going on the other machine in my console a minute ago. Now it just finished. We just saw it finish. Now that it has everything. You're going to see too, when you run this, you're going to see all these like warnings and things, and just ignore those. You can't do anything about it. When it tells you to that you can address these by running npm audit fix or force, I can guarantee you, if you do that, nothing is going to work. So your only option here, even though you see 4 critical issues, number 1 is that if you do this, stuff will break. Number 2, you can't do anything to change this other than go complain to Microsoft to get with it and get stuff updated and don't use old stuff. And number 3, I would argue that this is not an issue because you're not going to deploy any of these issues, these packages that have this stuff. You're not going to deploy this to SharePoint. You're only using this project to create an artifact, a SharePoint solution package that's going to contain our JavaScript file that contains the code for our web part. So here, I'm going to go into my web part and we'll take a look at it. Now, I picked the minimal template, which is a little too minimal for me. We kept asking Microsoft for a minimal template and they took us a bit too literally. But here's the basis for our web part. So what we have here is we're defining a class called Hello World Web Part, and it extends the base client-side web part. Then we are going to, it's going to call the render method to go render out our web part when it's time to render this. What that's going to do is we have access to where the div is on the page where our web part is going to be loaded here. So here you can see where I've got this div that's loading here saying styles hello world. What I'll do here is I'll go ahead and I'll just write something like hello webinar attendees. Thanks for joining. All right. So I'm going to save my changes. And to see this thing actually run, what I'm going to do is come over here into the terminal or into my console. And I'm going to run a tool called Gulp. And I'm going to tell it to use the task that Gulp has called serve. I'm going to run this. Now, what is this going to do? This is going to build the project. So all my TypeScript is going to go to JavaScript. It's going to do all the other stuff it needs to compile this thing up. Then it's going to launch a local web server to serve up the stuff that it just built on my server. What it then does as a third step is it's going to go launch the browser to go log into my Microsoft 365 tenant. Oh, I meant to log into this earlier. Sorry about this. And let it log in. What it's doing is it's launching this thing called the hosted workbench. Now, what's cool about this is running in a real SharePoint site. So you can see up here, if I zoom in, this is a real SharePoint site hosted in Microsoft 365. So that's my little developer tenant. And then this is all coming from Microsoft 365. I didn't deploy anything to Microsoft 365 though. This is all running on my server on my local machine. So you can see that if I go over here to the console, you can see that it got a request for something called manifest.json. What is that? What that is doing is that when I go to add a web part to the page to test it, the manifest.json is telling the SharePoint Framework runtime, here are all the things that are allowed to show up on the page from this server. So SharePoint, this toolbox is saying, here's everything that we have installed out of the box, all this stuff down here, and then here's all the stuff that's running locally. So when I click Hello World, it's going to render out my web part, which mine is just some simple text, but you can see that all of this was loading the JavaScript bundle that is the JavaScript bundled version of the TypeScript that we just wrote up here. It's that simple. It is seriously that simple. If I go make a change to this, if I make a change to my code, so if I come over here, thanks for joining, and I just saw somebody ask a question a minute ago, so I'll say, thanks for joining, but if you leave early, yes, this is being recorded and will be available next week. So I save my changes. You can see that everything is being rebuilt by not making any other changes. I just saved it. That triggered a rebuild. And now if I go back over to the browser and I refresh the page, you see everything showing up again, pulling it straight off my server. So now, so you can see this, right? And this is what's cool is that you have all of this right away. All right, nice and easy. Cool. Pen, there we go. Okay. Any other questions? And I did see another question here from Matt. He said, is there a way to not have to change the tenant every time in serve.json? So Matt's question, just for those of you to get a little bit more detailed here, what Matt's asking about is, let me go ahead and stop the server here. And I'll go ahead and close this out and let's go over here into config. If I go to serve.json, you will see what this is a configuration page or configuration file for the gulp serve task. The initial page, that's the page that it's loading. What the SharePoint Framework runtime is doing is it says, once it spins up the server, it checks to see, is something defined that it can replace this value on your machine. So it's great. Originally, we didn't have this with the SharePoint Framework. This is something that only has been available to us for about a year or so now, maybe 2 years. Oh gosh, what is the name of that? I forget what the name of the variable, what the environment variable is. Oh, Matt, good question. So effectively, it's in the docs. But if you search the SharePoint Framework developer documentation for tenant domain, you'll find the property. Oh, gulp. It's helping here. Oh, is it going to tell me that? Nope, that was GitHub Copilot. It's not giving me the info there. So that's an environment variable that's set on my machine, and I have it set to my developer tenant. So if you took this project and put it on your machine, oh, here we go. Here, let me just tab that out. Let's see if it actually does it. No, it's not doing it. GitHub Copilot, stupid AI. Oh, there we go. It's saying somebody just said this in the chat. Here, let me grab this, copy, come over here, and let me show you if I go back to my console, echo. Oh, there we go. Just found it. So if you put an environment variable on your machine called SPFx _serve_tenant_domain, when you put the domain there, if that environment variable has been detected, it will use that and replace it with tenant domain. The nice thing is if you don't have that environment variable on your machine, when you go to build your project, let me open up the terminal again. When you run it, the first time you run it, you see here that it says it's opening right here, is opening the that server right there. If it didn't find that environment variable, it'll actually have an error right there, have a message saying that it doesn't know where it is. But if you set this environment variable, then we can take you to a specific place. So, good question. Okay, so that's building out a web part. I want to talk a little bit more though about how you get started with this and give you some more resources. We'll tackle some questions here. So let me jump back over to our slides. And let's talk about what the developer environment story is. Now, I'm going to go through this a little fast in the interest of time. There's one thing I want to call out first as we go through this. And the reason why I'm going to go through it fast is because I'm going to give you a free resource at the end to where you can learn more about all of this. But also, I don't like the way Microsoft teaches this. The way I teach it is there's a lot of stuff, but you only need to focus on 2 or 3 things and ignore the rest. So here's the thing. What I would suggest for your own developer environment is what you need is you're going to need a SharePoint site. And you can use one that is provided by your company, or you can have your own personal tenant that you get. What I normally would say until about a year ago was I would go get one of the developer tenants from the Microsoft 365 developer program because it's free. It includes SharePoint Online. You get like 25 E5 licenses. You can't use it for any like real stuff. You're only supposed to use it for development. But the bad story is you can't really do that now because if you remember last year in January, Microsoft got hacked pretty bad. It was part of the Midnight Blizzard hack, which was done by a group called Nobelium. And they actually got in through the developer program by spinning up thousands or millions of these developer tenants and sending out billions of phishing emails. So they were like, oops, stop. So they shut it down and they're doing something to kind of lock it down more. The sad story of this is they originally said that this is probably going to be done by September of 2024. Then they got pushed out to about the beginning of the year. And unfortunately, ever since last August, they won't respond to anything or say anything about it. So I'm just going to be completely blunt. This story sucks right now. I have an article that does explain this. If you go to my site, voitanos.io, and you just search for dev tenant, there's something that talks about the state of the developer program in summer 2024. Unfortunately, that's also true in February 2025. But effectively, there are certain ways you can get a dev tenant. They have to be able to identify who you are, and they do it through a couple different programs, like an ISV program or a Visual Studio subscription program. But other than that, your only other option is to buy a tenant. What my recommendation is to, if you want the cheapest thing you can possibly do is you go get a business basics license, which is $6 a month with a 1-year commitment, right? So that's only going to be like 6 times 12 is, I think, $60. Is that right? Or $72 US. So I look at that as saying, if I want to do SharePoint development, I have to pay $72 a year. That's the cost of doing business. Okay, so I don't go get a coffee at a coffee shop once a month, and you'll be able to cover it. Probably actually these days, once every 2 months. Anyway, that's the best story I got for you right now. That's your hosted environment that you're going to be able to deploy stuff and test it in real SharePoint. But you also can do stuff on your local machine. So what can you do? Well, For those of you who are on-prem, you can use a thing called the SharePoint Workbench, which is on your local developer machine because it was part of the SharePoint framework whenever we spun up a new project. But we got rid of that, and so today that's no longer available. It is available for those old versions of SharePoint Framework, but is not in the current ones. Like version 1.20 is the current one today as of this webinar, as of this session. What we can do is we can use the hosted workbench in SharePoint Online. So what do we need? Well, you're going to have to install a few things to get started. You're going to need to install Node, which is also going to include NPM. Node is our runtime. That's the thing that's going to allow us to run all of these different tools. They're all built on Node, which is cross-platform JavaScript. We're also going to install a tool called Yeoman and the Yeoman generator for the SharePoint framework. That's the tool that I ran earlier to ask me those questions in the console and to was scaffold my project up to be able to work on a project. Then I'm also going to have to install a tool called Gulp, and that's going to be my task runner. You saw me do that to say Gulp serve, but I'm going to also do that to bundle my project up and to package it. And then lastly, we're going to use a tool called Webpack to take all of our JavaScript files and scrunch them together. You don't have to install that. That's included with every project. So let me just talk a little bit here about Node and NPM. And in the interest of time, like I said, I'm going to go through this stuff kind of quick. The one thing I want to call out here with Node is that there's an easy way. There's two ways to go through and install Node, and they're on this slide here. Really just explains like, hey, if you're an old school .NET developer, here's like what the tools that you're used to using, and then here's the stuff that we use for the SharePoint framework, and it kind of maps like we do TypeScript, we don't use C#, and we use Visual Studio Code, the blue Visual Studio, and Yeoman to replace where .NET developers use Visual Studio. Or we use NPM for our package manager where .NET uses NuGet. Or we use Node where you would use .NET. We use Gulp as a replacement for MS Build. And then Webpack, there's no comparison to it because when you compile like C#, it always compiles it into a library. Okay, so back to the Node thing. This is my recommendation. Microsoft now is okay with it. Originally, they were like, no, we don't recommend doing this, but they're like, we can't support this. It's like, you can't know if I'm doing it. I've done this for 7 years and it's worked just fine. And this is how most people do it. Option one is go get a version of Node that is compatible with the version of SharePoint framework you're using and install that on your machine from the nodejs.org website. That is option one. However, if you do that, you only have one version of Node installed on your computer and you're stuck with that. And you have one global package registry on your computer. The downside with that is that some tools require different versions of Node. If you jump between customers that are using different versions of the SharePoint framework, you would have to do all these uninstalls and reinstalls every time you switch projects. I use a tool called NVM. There is the one that I would recommend you look at here is this last one. I'm still playing with this. Today, I currently use NVM because I'm on a Mac. There is a Windows version of it, but like the code has been on a code freeze for a while because it basically is kind of defaulting over to this one, the Fast Node Manager, FNM. That's the one that I would recommend. That's the one that I'm switching to, at least on my local machine. That's what I use. On my demo machine, I'm going to do with you guys. I'm not using FNM, but everything I'm doing is very similar to what FNM does. The nice thing with FNM is that it's cross-platform. It works both on Windows and in Mac, and it's really fast. It's all written in Rust. I would do this because this allows us to have multiple versions of it, and you'll see where the benefit is. Like I just ran the SharePoint framework on a setup that I already had configured. Because I'm using NVM, I'm going to go through a brand new setup with you guys in just a second and show you how this works. The rest of these slides here are going to talk a little about what is Yeoman. So what is Yeoman? How do you use it? And what do you need? You're going to install Yeoman globally and the generator. So Yeoman is the engine. The generator is that app Microsoft generator-SharePoint. It's not a typo. Generator dash is what Yeoman looks for when it tries to find generators. But when you run them, you don't put generator in the word or in the command. The resource I'm going to give you at the end is going to walk through and explain these in a lot more detail. And I want to make sure I'm being efficient with my time here. I see we got 4 minutes till the top of the hour. The webinar is scheduled to go for an hour and a half. So I got another really 34 minutes here, but I know that some people only kind of block out like 30 minutes for these, or sorry, an hour for these. But I'm happy to stick around and answer questions for until the bottom of the hour. So in about 35 4 minutes. I'm going to run through these in a minute, though. Another thing is Gulp. You want to install something called the Gulp CLI. You don't want to install Gulp. Gulp is going to be in every single project already, but you have to put the Gulp CLI, install it globally on your machine, because different projects can use different versions of Gulp. The CLI allows us to have a runner that knows how to run all the different versions. So think of this as kind of like the proxy. So you're going to install it by saying npm install -g, that is shorthand for -- global, and then you tell it the name of the package you want to install. All right. This thing is just going to be our task runner. This is the thing that's allowing us to do all these different tasks and stuff that the SharePoint Framework build toolchain is already including for us. Webpack is used to take all of these JavaScript files and put them all together into a single bundle for performance reasons, both for the user and for our deployment. Now, we will, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there's a lot of stuff that we can do with Webpack to customize our build, and with Gulp. So if that's something you're interested in seeing, let me know. Maybe we can do a webinar on that in the future. But I teach that in my class, doing all sorts of really advanced stuff. Okay, how do you get started? Like, you want to get started, you want to start building your first SharePoint web part and get to what I just did a minute ago. Let's go back and let's do that. So here's what we're going to do here. What I'm going to do, let's put me up here actually. Let's get out of this. Let me shrink this down. And let's go ahead and close that. And let's clear this out. And that's fine what that is. Let's come over here. Let's go back to my terminal window here. And again, if you're in Windows, I'm in Mac, but if you're in Windows, the story is basically going to be the same. All right. So what we want to do is I want to show you how to get a brand new environment stood up. Now I said, as you see here, I already have Node installed. So when I run, let me move this up here in case some of you are looking, it's maybe harder to see at the bottom of the screen. Let's go bigger. Hello, let's go bigger, please. That's supposed to go bigger. Here we go like this. Let's move this over. Nope, don't do it like that. I just told you not to do that. So go like this. Okay, clear that out. Can we go, nope, bigger. Why isn't it letting me go bigger? Oh, there, slow, it's kind of laggy. That's interesting. Here, let's go like this. Increase font. Oh, shift. Wait. Interesting. It's not responding to that command. All right, that's fine. Your other commands are working. So I can say, do I have Node installed? And it goes, yes. You have version 18.20.5. Okay. And because of that, I also can see what kinds of global packages do I have installed. Do I have a SharePoint Framework deployment already set up here? So npm lists-g says, show me everything that is installed globally. And I can see that it's already got Yeoman installed. It's got the Gulp CLI installed. And I've also got the SharePoint Framework generator. But I want to show you to get started for the very first time. So let's start out fresh and clean. I want to go get a brand new version of Node. Now, I go based on my recommendation I had for you a minute ago, is that I use the Node version manager. So by looking at the Node version manager, I can see what things do I have installed on this machine. What versions of Node do I have installed? So I have versions, a version 16, a version 18, and version 23. And I've also installed Node via nodejs.org. So that's my system version. So you can see the green arrows pointing to this one right here, 18.20. But I had to do some testing recently, and I even created I even installed a version for for Node 16, where I installed the SharePoint Framework version 1.15 deep inside of it. Now, why did I do that? Just to show, just for some testing for a student. We were trying to figure something out. But what's nice here is I can create these little aliases to make it easier to jump around. Okay, that's all fine and good. How do I get my environment stood up? Let's go get a brand new version of Node so I can start fresh and you can see what that looks like. So what I need to do is I need to find a version that I don't already have installed. So I'm going to say nvm ls remote, and it's going to go out to the Node.js website and get a list of all of the installed versions. Now, I know that the current version of the SharePoint Framework is supported on Node version 18 and which is an LTS version, a long-term support. So 18.20.7 is the newest one. So I'm going to go ahead and install that first. I'm going to say nvm Node Version Manager install the 18.20, I think it said .7. Oh, sorry, that was I don't want to be in agent mode. Sorry, this is like an AI infused terminal. No, out of agent mode. No, not agent mode. Was it LS? Am I not in agent mode? Okay, now I'm not in agent mode. All right, cool. So NVM install v 18.20.7, I think is what it was. And so what this is now doing is going out to the Node.js website and downloading the installer, and it's installing it. And now that it's installed, I can see what version am I running? 18.20.7. Cool. If I nvm list or ls for list, it's going to tell me, yep, you got 18.20.7. Kind of went by a little quick there. So you can see we're pointing to 18.20.7. But this time when I look at the Node package manager and say, what do I have installed? So node npm list G, what do I have installed globally? And it's like nothing for the SharePoint framework. So if I did yo at Microsoft SharePoint now, it's not going to work. Here's how you go through and set up your developer environment. Number one, install Node. How you do it is up to you. I strongly recommend you use a Node version manager, as do many other people. I would use the fast node manager, FNM. Right now I'm showing you NVM. Same. Microsoft will tell you you need to go install things like this. npm install -g yo. Then they'll say on the next line, say npm install, that's Yeoman. Then you would install the Yeoman generator for the SharePoint framework, which is at Microsoft /generator -SharePoint. And then they would say, and then you need to install the gulp CLI. Those three commands, run those three commands. So Yeoman, the Yeoman generator for the SharePoint framework, and the gulp CLI after you install Node. Or I'm going to show you, do it easy. Do it all in one line. Yo space at Microsoft /generator -SharePoint and gulp -CLI. Hit enter. And now it's going to go grab all three of those and everything that they need. And it's going to install all of those globally on my machine. This can take 2 minutes or so, maybe 3 minutes. I wish somebody had a question here that I could go through and address right now to kill some time, but it looks like I had no. Oh, there are some questions here. Yes. So I have some questions here. So let me go through these in just a second. Or let me go through these while all this is going on. So I see, can't tell who your name is. You didn't put your name in, but I see you said, can I share a link for setting up your developer tenant? I will do that. In fact, you're going to get an email from me that's going to have it a little bit later. In fact, I'm going to give you an entire video course that I've done for free on showing you how to do it. So I'm going to put a like on that one because I will definitely do that. Jose asked, do you recommend SPFx fast serve tool for development? I don't want to say that I recommend it. But that doesn't mean I don't. It's more that I don't have a problem with it. I see the value in it, but I focus a lot on teaching people how to do SharePoint development, and I don't want you to rely on tools that not everybody can use. This is an intro webinar, and I would not recommend people dive into that just yet. I would say, do what I'm doing here. Don't use any more tools than this. And then later, if you're like, is there any stuff I can do to make things better? And then it's like, yes, I'll show you how to do this. I like to think about it, like, think about when you're learning how to drive, right? Drive a car. You don't get all the tips and tricks on like what you can and can't do. Like, is it okay to go through and to make a right on red in the United States? Like in most places it is. Can I do a rolling stop? In most places you can, but you gotta be careful. How do you know that? I don't want to overload you with that stuff on day one when you're trying to learn how to drive. Let's make sure we don't kill ourselves first, right? So that's kind of the same thing I'm doing with this. So I don't tell you avoid it. I just want to be a little more careful with it. Let me look at this. So someone says, great session. Thanks a lot. I'm a SharePoint Framework expert looking for Teams apps development. Do you have a session plan for developing bot aces? Great question. Look at my list of my webinars. I've got a couple Teams developer sessions. I will tell you that if you are looking to build bot-enabled aces, you are probably one of 10 people in the world who would be interested in that. And I'm not being catty about that. It is the probably one of the lowest adopted features I've ever seen from a company like Microsoft. And the reason why I don't want to promote it is because hardly anybody's using it. I wouldn't be surprised if like sometime down the road, Microsoft's like, nobody's using it. We're not going to keep supporting this. We're done. and they just deprecate it. So I'm not so sure that I have a lot of confidence in the future of that feature. So no offense to what you were saying, but okay. You saw all this was done. It all finished pretty quick. It took me 37 seconds to install everything. So now if I go in and say npm list-g, I should have everything installed. And if I create a new folder for my second web part, and I go into that, and I do yo at Microsoft/SharePoint, check it out. Everything is all set up. I can set up my second web part. This time I'll set up a React-based web part. And now I have my entire developer environment up and running to be able to get this project up and running and working right off the bat. And showing you what a React-based web part looks like. The only difference that you really see here is inside the render method here. Come on, keep scrolling. Why did you stop scrolling? Oh, it's going to do a huge jump, I bet, in a second. There. So this is where the only thing that really changed with this. And what you're seeing here is like that. So what you're seeing here is all we're doing is we're creating an instance or reference to a React element that we create that's also living in this project. The element is called Hello World. It's actually being imported from components Hello World TSX. Then it's setting the public properties on it. This is like, think of this as like the equivalent of if I had in an HTML, I said hello world and then description, and I bound no, I can't spell description. And I bound description to this .properties.description. I did it like that. So that's just the one property, but I would do all the other ones. So this is just like the code way of doing the markup version. And then to render it on the page, I'm just calling React DOM.render. Where do you want to render this React element? I want you to render it into the div where my web part is being hosted. Cool. So we got our developer environment up and running really, really fast, right? So we're in really good shape here. So now let me go back and let's jump back to our slides and let's go ahead and start. I'm giving you some little bit more resources and stuff, and I'm going to open it up to more questions for you. So I have a ton of free resources that are available to you to get you up and running. One of you asked about a course that you could follow. So I have a couple free courses. So the first two you see here, one is explore and evaluate the SharePoint framework. I think it's 10 days or 8 days or 10 days. And the intention with this is that I'm going to walk you through, here's everything the SharePoint framework can do. And it allows you to kind of walk away and say, this is a good solution for my project. I think I like this. I think this will work. Or you're going to walk away and say, nope, no way, not doing JavaScript, not doing TypeScript. I'm sticking with .NET. Forget the SharePoint framework. My goal is for you to be able to say, this is for me or not for me. And then the next question is, this is for my project or not. So if you're at that phase, that first course is for you. The second one, I want to get up and running I want to get my environment up and running and better understand all that stuff that Andrew said about Node and NPM and Gulp and Yeoman and Webpack and all of that. And that's what the second course is. To understand the SPFx toolchain, that is a 9 or 10 day course on email course, walking through all of those things. So these email courses, you get it when you sign up. Within a few minutes, you get day one. And then the next day you'll get the second installment. They're all supposed to be about 5 to 15 minutes long. So great if you're on your morning commute or something, just to kind of get a feel for what's going on. The first one here actually has a bonus in it that if you do the homework assignments, which are really like basic, if you do a homework assignment, you submit it, it's just 2 questions in a form to kind of check your knowledge. You will get the next day's installment within a few minutes or like within an hour, something like that. This third option here, I have a very large course called the Mastering the SharePoint Framework. And it comes with lots of content. The ultimate bundle ultimately has, I think, like 42 hours of content in it, teaching everything you could want to know with the SharePoint framework. The first 3 chapters of that I make free, and that is in the starter bundle. So you can, on my site, when you go to it, you can buy it, but there's no price tag and there's no credit card required. But you have to go through the checkout process, and that gets you into my course library. It contains 3 chapters. One is basically what we just went through on what is the SharePoint framework. 2 is explains what all the stuff in the Mastering the SharePoint Framework is. But the third chapter is let's walk through and get your developer environment set up. And so I walk through all the steps of like what I just went through. So the person that said, hey, can you point me to a link on how to go get everything set up? It's this email course right here and the chapter 3 from this starter bundle. If you want to go further with this, then you're more than welcome to. I have a whole bunch of on-demand courses. I have small ones on this like build SPFx web parts, extensions, and adaptive cards. These run $65 to $75. And then the Mastering the SharePoint Framework Fundamentals and Ultimate Bundle is a much bigger body of work that is all about that if you really want to dive into the SharePoint framework. I've had like thousands of people go through my Mastering the SharePoint Framework course. It's got lots of great ratings, so you can go check out the site and learn more about it. If you're attending this webinar live later today, you're going to get an email from me with a special offer as well if you're interested. So the link down there at the bottom will take you to the page where all these courses are found. And it starts with email courses that are free, then the cheaper courses to the more advanced stuff towards the very bottom. There is a thing called an accelerator. I'm not going to talk about that today. If you're interested in that, there's a way that you can go through and fill out a form and we can talk about it. And it's a much more immersive experience where I teach the SharePoint framework over 8 weeks with students. So like I'm in week 7 of my current accelerator with about 20 students. Okay. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join me today. I've got time to answer questions. I will check to see if anybody has any questions submitted just yet. Doesn't look like I have anything here I missed. So if you have a question, please feel free and post it. But before you go, what I would ask is you please take a minute to go to my website and look at some of my upcoming webinars. You can find those at boitanos.io/webinars. And for those of you who are attending live, you're going to be getting an email later today that is going to contain a form asking you for some feedback. I really would appreciate getting your feedback. Again, first time I'm doing one of these webinars with Teams. I hope I didn't screw anything up. I hope everything is actually working. Based on getting some questions here, seems like everything's okay. So that's one. I'm also would love to get your ideas and requests for future webinars. I have a few that are planned over the next couple months, but I left some space to make sure I could, address what people want. It's not just about me saying what I want to talk about. And then, like I said, special offer. So I will include in that email a discount code for 25% off any of my SharePoint Framework developer courses that is good until a week from tomorrow. So it's good for the next week. All right. Okay. Now, with that, remember, early on, a bunch of you had questions. So I said we weren't doing the advanced stuff. So what did we cover? Well, in this class, benefits and capabilities of SharePoint Framework. We kind of did that. We did most of that, I think. What are the basic building blocks? I went through that and how to get started and what the toolchain overview was. I think we did all of that. In this self-teaching setup, I gave you free course offers that I have, and both email courses and video courses. And I gave you some of the paid options that I have, but I want to make sure that, just disclaimer, some of those are paid options, right? This is how I make a living. On the specific use cases, there are only some stuff that I did. So for, like I said, we weren't going to do anything about customizing search. That was way beyond what we want to cover. We got to get the basics of SharePoint Framework done first. Web parts for provisioning, data integration, document management, SaaS. I admitted early on, I want to make sure you knew we weren't going to cover that stuff because this was an introductory, what is the SharePoint Framework? And then finally, technical implementations here, project structure, recommendations, and file organization. I mean, I guess we didn't really do this, but I did show you some of the folder structure. If you wanted to go more into that, if you post a question in the chat, we've got another 15 minutes for the webinar, and I'm more than happy to dive into that. And if not, if we run out of time or something, I can always send you a link to where I can send you an article that kind of walks through what these folders and files are. In the very first chapter of my fundamentals bundle of my course, I go through every single folder and file in painstaking detail. And I basically say, here's what it is. And then you can ignore it. You need this and you need to understand how it works. So you can ignore it, or you need this and you understand how it works. Or not only could you ignore it, you could delete it. Or don't touch this unless you know what you're doing. Right? Kind of things. So I think we went through most of your questions. I addressed most of them. I appreciate a lot of the interest on some of these things. I guess we got some people who are a little more on the advanced side. For this webinar, you were looking for some things about like app registrations and all of these things I can talk about. Oh, you know what I didn't show you? This whole thing about creating spas with SharePoint Online versus web parts. Let me jump back to that really fast. Let me show you how easy this is. This web part right now, it works. It'll work in Teams. So I showed you how it works in SharePoint by adding it to the page, right? This is second web part, but first web part was the same way. Without me doing anything, this web part will also work in a full page, as a single page app, and it will also work as a personal app, and it'll work inside of Teams. How does that work? Inside of each web part, so we're in the web part file here, there's this manifest JSON file. And inside this file, there is a property called supported hosts, right? And this is what the default is. This says this web part can be used as a web part in SharePoint. It can be used as a single page app. Microsoft calls it a SharePoint full page, but trust me, it's a single page app. It's just kind of like has the SharePoint branding and stuff in it. You can do a Teams tab, and you can also do it, as a personal app, which is pinned on the left-hand rail, or in Teams, or you can do it as a tab inside of a channel or a group chat. And effectively the way that works is the web part is added to a page in SharePoint with no SharePoint branding. And so your end users don't really know that it's going to live, that it's actually running from SharePoint when you're inside of Teams. If you don't want to support one of these, you basically just say, nope, I only want it to be done as a web part. Then you just delete these things. And when you package it up and deploy it, it's only available as a web part. The Teams options, once you've deployed your SharePoint, we didn't talk about deployment today, but once you've deployed the solution to your app catalog in your SharePoint tenant, there is a second step you do to get it to work in Teams, and you'll see a Teams icon listed next to it. In fact, I think I can show you that. Let me go to my SharePoint Admin Center. I think I have a solution in the tenant catalog. We go to more features, and I pick apps. I don't have one installed. Okay. So what this would do is if I had a package deployed, you will see, I think it's here under state, you will see a SharePoint logo. And then if it's got the Teams properties on one of the components, like one of the web parts in the project that I just talked about in the supported host part of the manifest, you will see Teams icons right after it as well. And what that will do then is that will allow you to, once you see that, you select the solution, and you'll have a new button up here on the toolbar where you could say deploy this to push this to the Teams App Store, and then the SharePoint solution will be available also in Teams. Okay. Well, guess what? Now I'm really done. So let's go back to our slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have. So I do see somebody post. We have one or two. Oh, we got a couple. Oh, we got a bunch. Oh, lovely. All right, so I'm going to start from the ones that got first. So this one is from D, who said, "Did they disable our tenants if we have an E5 account? If we already have an E5 account? If you are, I think the question was about did they disable our developer tenants if you already had an E5 account? And the answer is no. They don't. They're not associated with each other at all. You don't have your E5 your commercial Microsoft 365 tenants are not associated with your developer tenants in any way. Maybe by an email address, but they're not associated with each other. The only thing that they did with the dev tenants is that if you're not using it, or if you were using it for non-developer reasons, it was automatically retired. As long as you were using it, so like the stuff that I did today, that was me using it. Mine is continuously being renewed, and you get notified that it's being automatically renewed if you're using it. So they did not kill off any existing tenants. Well, unless you're part of the Nobilium guys, the Nobilium hackers, they killed all those tenants. But I'm assuming you're not D. Then hopefully safely assuming that they would not have deleted it unless you weren't using it. And if you weren't using it in the last 3 months, then it might have been purged. Naveen says, how much TypeScript do you need to learn to be able to develop specifically for SharePoint admins learning debt? Naveen, great question. We traded some emails. I don't think learning a language should be a prerequisite for doing certain development stuff. I think it's easier to pick up a language in context of learning how to build. There are some fundamental concepts with TypeScript that I guess is nice to know, but most of the time when my students say, I don't have any experience with TypeScript, what course do you recommend I go get before I start doing my SharePoint Framework course? And I'm like, if you're getting my SharePoint Framework course, as I go through stuff, I explain TypeScript along the way. Not every little thing, but I explain like enough for you to get by. And I think if you take that and a lot of the free stuff that's already out there on like TypeScript education, or even if you use ChatGPT, like this is some code in TypeScript. What does it do? I think that you don't need to go learn those language things. So for me personally I wouldn't worry too much about it. Maybe go read up on TypeScript or go watch like a video on YouTube that is like maybe no more than like a 20-minute introduction to TypeScript for web developers. I would do that and kind of get a feel for like, do I feel I have a conceptually understand what's going on? Because then you pick it up along the way. It's the same thing with like React. Like when I don't like going to say like, go buy this React course in order to build a React application. It's like, no, let's try and build an application. Let's learn React as we go. And from there, you'll have some context. And it's like, now we need to go. Again, let's go back to the driving analogy I had earlier. I'm teaching my daughter how to drive. We're going to go on a trip this summer. I'm not going to go take her to another city and teach her how to drive in that city before I'm going to let her go drive in the city. She's going to learn how to drive like by doing. And so I think that that's kind of the same way that I think it's easier to learn languages and frameworks by doing and not by trying to get all this prerequisite stuff. That's my approach. However, I understand not everybody likes to learn that way. I don't think you need to know a lot of TypeScript though for this to get into SharePoint Framework. Okay. That's just my take. Ingrid, is there an easy way to update an existing older web part to the newest tool chain? So there are different approaches. In fact, actually, let me grab a link for you, Ingrid. Actually, let me just find this in let's go back to our VM here. Voitanos.io. So you said, is there an easy way to update an existing one? There's a lot of, it depends in that question. One of my recent articles, if you go to voitanos.io and under Learn, you'll find a section called Articles. And an article, not that one. In an article that I published last week, I think it was. Actually, no, 9 days ago. Actually, it's not a week. It was the subject of my last newsletter that I did. You can subscribe to my newsletter too, if you like, from our website. This walks through a bunch of stuff about the upgrades. You said an easy way. That depends. If I'm going from one version behind to the current version, yes, there's an easy way. In this article, I will refer you to, this talks about some of the stuff here. Let's give you a couple pointers here. There is a tool called the CLI for Microsoft 365, and you run this command, M365 project upgrade. Project upgrade, and that will tell you everything you need to do to upgrade from one version to the next. However, if you have a very old project and you want to upgrade to the current version, that's what this article talks about and saying you're really doing an upgrade from that original version you're on to the next one, and then you're doing it again and again and again and again. And if you have a lot of those, in my opinion, I don't think it's worth it. I think it's better to just start with a new project. And in this article, I show you, hey, look, create a brand new project with the latest version. Here's some things you need to keep an eye on. Copy the code from the old one over to the new one, just the code, not all the other structure of the project. Now, make sure it's working, right? So test it locally. You're going to have a lot of things that pop up, a lot of warnings and stuff from linting errors and things that are going to pop up. But you're going to have to go make those code updates. And then you're going to go do one more step at the very end. And that's where this oops, nope. That's my form to do that. In the article here, it talks about upgrading the project. So there you go, upgrade the projects. And then this manual approach here is the one that I'm referring to right now for the longer one. So like if I'm going from version 1.4.1 to 1.20, I think that what you want to do is start with a brand new project, and then you want to be careful about grabbing, making sure you pick the same name. And then after you do that, you want to go update a couple of these unique IDs so that now your new project, when you deploy it to SharePoint thinks this new project is really the updated version of the old one. That approach is so much easier. I get this question a lot. In fact, this was kind of inspired. This is from myself and two other, Paolo Piorsi, who at the time was not Microsoft, but now he is, and a guy named Peter Carson, where we got this question on a panel that we did at the European SharePoint conference in Stockholm last December. So I felt like, hey, me answering the question would be a good one. So for this one. So that's how I would do it. I'd take a look at this for you. And in fact, let me grab the link to this and I'll just drop that in the chat or as a comment to your question, Ingrid. All right. Okay. So John has a question. You mentioned having the ability to override the new and edit forms on the list. Is there a link you can point me to with more details? I heard that Microsoft was going to implement this, but never looked into the details. If you, yeah, let me grab a link for you. So first of all, form customizer. Yeah, this one. So here's like an example of it, right? So here's one that I do in my class. So let me grab this for you first, John, and I'll put this in the chat. And then I also, let me grab the, AKA dot, let me go to the developer, the official docs. And extensions, form customizer. Okay, so let me copy this over. All right, so I'm gonna give you two links, John. All right, let me explain what I did here. So link number one that I just responded to your question, John. Link one is for the official documentation. And this kind of explains like what this is, how you can look at it. Here's the problem with these guys, is that I'm just the messenger, okay? This is a crappy story that Microsoft did, and I admit it, and I tried to help fix it. That's what my article was that I just I was on just a second ago. The good story is that we can do this. We can create these form customizers and we can create our own solutions. And like, here's an example of it where I'm on a list. And when I select edit, it pops up and I see my edit form that I want to be, or I click the new form and I see my edit form that has like a cascading dropdown. I select this thing and these options change and I want to store the data a different way. The part that stinks about this is that Microsoft gave us no way to install this. So you can create these and you deploy them and you're like, why isn't it working? Because you have to manually go wire it up to the list and you can't do it through the UI. You have to do it through code. So what the second link that I give you is in this article. I show you a project that I created that is a web part that allows you to pick a list and then you have to pick a content type as well. And then it allows you to install the form on your form customizer on the form by just hitting save or removing it. The nice thing is this project, if you want to learn how this works, the article's right here, or if you scroll down on the site, you'll see a video to it as well. There's a video version of the site where I demo the whole thing, how it works. And in my Mastering the SharePoint Framework Fundamentals bundle of my course, we actually build this. But I show a video of it working. I kind of explain how it works in the article. And then if you go to the article, you can also, at the very bottom of it, explain how it works too. You can download the resources. You can actually get the download for it as well. D says, have I seen a shift in the use of SharePoint in teams with the adoption of AI tools? I'm not sure what you mean by that. I haven't seen any kind of a change with SharePoint. Microsoft will probably complain about that, saying that, because they'll say, what about the SharePoint agents? What I have seen here, so I know I'm 1 minute over. I'm gonna finish up these questions and then we're gonna wrap it up. Let me see. Let's see the questions that we got here. Let me go ahead and load this right now. How many more do we have? Yeah, I got a few more questions. I'm gonna do the rest of the questions. Last question here is gonna be from, well, I can't tell who your name is. I'll come back. Yes. I'm a Lego fan. Can you tell? I love the Lego Technics cars, and then I have a whole bunch of space stuff. You can see right there, a Saturn V rocket back there. And a Porsche. Well, yeah, Porsche and a Porsche. And I'm working on the McLaren right now. Okay. So the only thing I've seen that's really different is in Teams. Yes, there's been a shift, and the only shift I've seen is that is the client for Copilot. And also with Teams, we used to build as building bots, and we called them conversational bots. Now we build, we really just call them chat bots, and we leverage AI to build more powerful chat bots. So kind of yes. Someone said, do I need to set up Teams context and authentication for the web part to work in Teams, or does it work directly without any additional steps? You don't have to do anything extra in Teams. Because once you have packaged up the project and deployed it to your app catalog, your SharePoint Framework project with the web part, and then you get the extra step that I told you about, once that's done, you should be good to go. Because it will then show up as an option for people to install within a channel, or to install as an app for their company. Like it'll be a solution deployed to your organization. So provided your organization allows custom apps, your tenant has turned that on and hasn't which is a whole step with that with Teams. But there's nothing like what you say here about setup context and authentication. You don't have to worry about that at all. Matt says, Lego fan, absolutely. D says, okay, thanks. Cool. You're welcome, D. Matt says, if someone purchases the Ultimate Bundle, how much time do you have to access the content? 90 days, a year, forever. You have, it's a lifetime license. So you buy it today, you get access to it forever, all the content forever, and I am doing updates to it. There's a lot of changes coming with Voitanos in the next couple of months. I will just say that is true right now, and I'll leave it at that. I can't go into more detail this time. But you will have access to the content forever, as long as I'm around. And when I'm around, I mean like I'm not like in the ground. Someone said, do I need to learn? This is the last question we'll do. Someone asked, do I need to learn .NET to become a Microsoft 365 apps developer, including the back end? Nope. In fact, dirty little secret, I haven't used .NET in almost 10 years. Me personally, I do all of my server-side and client-side development using TypeScript. My preference is React for my web framework. All of my Azure web apps, Azure Functions, Azure Container Apps, everything is all done with TypeScript and Node. Someone could argue it's not nearly as fast as .NET because it's all interpreted. Fine, you can say that. I'm not entirely that concerned with the performance for the majority of the stuff that I'm doing. It is not running at such a ridiculous scale. And furthermore, I believe that I am much more productive using the same language and tool set for testing and automation and developer tools and improvements and enhancements that I have in my developer environment. I would rather stay with one language and not go through different task switching for like doing like a was it multitasking when I'm switching between server and client. To me, life is easier that way. And my productivity gains from that far outweigh any performance concerns. And when it comes to server-side performance-based stuff, and someone says, well, .NET is going to be faster than TypeScript, I'm like, yeah, but if I'm doing everything in Azure, like almost everything, single thing I use in Azure has an ability to just say, if it's under too much load, scale it. And quite frankly, I mean, everybody's going to have a different reason for this, and it doesn't fit every solution. I can do .NET. I've done .NET. I would be not as productive today because it's been a long time since I've actually like done .NET actively. But I would rather throw a few extra dollars. And when I say few, I mean like less than like $10 or $20 to scale my solution out to like multiple Azure Function apps to handle any performance stuff that people would say is not going to be happening compared to, or to either scale up to a more powerful server or a faster server, like a better CPU, so it's doing the interpretation faster, or scaling out if it's a load-based issue as well, using TypeScript. So that's just my approach. But no, you do not need to learn .NET. There's JavaScript and TypeScript is so pervasive across the developer landscape today. I don't think you have to learn anything like that. In fact, I think that the people that only do server-side dev, I'm going to get myself in trouble by saying this, I think that they are more at a disadvantage because they can't do client-side solutions, because that's where what all the users end up seeing, and almost everything you build is going to have some sort of a client-based interface. It's just my opinion. Okay. Great questions. I don't have any more outstanding questions. So everybody, thank you very much for joining me today.